You're listening to the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT podcast. I'm your host and curator, Rabbi Avraham Kivlevitz, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Clear the aisles. The Projectionist has Semicha. Hey, I'm here with Kolakowski, and we're here, of course, to darshan about old movies and vintage TV. Yitzchak, we've got an interesting lineup, I think, tonight of what we want to talk about. And as usual, we think that perhaps rediscovering or discovering these things for the first time might actually enhance, at least, not only give you enjoyment, but maybe give you something more to think about than usual. Yitzchak, I think I'm going to go first tonight, and then we're going to change up a little bit, and then we'll flip it from there, okay? So, programs that could be, in certain ways, has the greatest afterlife, perhaps, of any television show that is no longer, it's no longer around, and that is Star Trek. And there still is another version of Star Trek that I think CBS is running now, and the fact that this franchise has such a life is really a testament to the incredible ingenuity of that first 3 years of that program. There were in the 50s, by the way, I think there was a show called Space Force, and there were other shows. Of course, there were other programs that there was Lost in Space and other programs about people on a spaceship but there was something about Star Trek that touched a chord, and I think part of it was the fact that there was a limit on the special effects. There was sort of a knowledge that special effects would only take them so far. And that really the stories that Gene Roddenberry and DC Fontana and the other writers and producers were involved in, it had to be something that spoke not just to the monstrous or to the impossible, but to the here and now. And that really the purpose of Star Trek was to project a possible future, but also to comment, like all great science fiction, on what was happening in the world today and how they could relate issues of the time to the imagined possibilities of the future. And this could happen with the various planets that were being studied and also the interpersonal connection. Really, the power of the program in many ways is really, in a way, could be really emphasized just by the three main characters, which, of course, are Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. These three characters themselves are enough to carry most of the programs. And I know you're not a big fan of Star Trek, but the idea of having an ultimate logician who looks at things from the most logical, utilitarian perspective, Spock, and then a very emotional, albeit scientific person, McCoy, who looked at things based on, he's a doctor, but he's also a human being with a heart. And then, of course, there's Kirk himself, who is the adventurous human who, in a way, is sometimes taken by the emotional and by the spirit, and other times taken by the mind. And these three together, whatever episodes you're going to put them in, whatever situation, the characterization that was put into the mouths of these actors and the way they spoke it. And of course, then you have, of course, the assembled characters, the fact that gave the show an afterlife, because the show was canceled after 3 years. And we know that even the third year of the program, the year 1968, 1969, the program was in the threat of being canceled. I think it was only brought back for a second year because of the fans wrote in to NBC. The show was outdone by many programs in its time, but the reason why there's a longevity, why people go back to it, is because there's a power to the writing. Now, I know, of course, about the Star Trek phenomena. You can't not be aware of it. You know what Trekkies are, Trekkie conventions. We know, I mean, Yitzchak, you are a person who goes to, Monster Bash, and you realize that the conventions you go to are simulated by total Star Trek conventions, where people like George Takei and James Doohan and maybe Shatner himself show up, or Michelle Nichols, or someone who played a small part in one episode, and the same sort of fan fiction and fan excitement that you are very aware of the monster films and the films that you're aware of, that you are such a chassid of. You know that exists in spades in terms of Trekkie conventions. Perhaps it's died down. I don't know. But with the Next Generation, with Deep Space Nine, with whatever the other Discovery or Enterprise or all the other programs that are going on, it seems to be something that doesn't have. It's not going to wither away. Now I don't know if it's a schluss. Star Trek. I did see one episode of the original series when it first aired. And it was the very last episode of the first series. And it was called Turnabout, Intruder. And I saw it, and there's a reason why I saw it. It was on a Tuesday night in June 1969. You were in a different Gilgal then. I don't know who you were at that time. I don't know if you were watching in your previous Gilgal, but I was watching it in this Gilgal. Now, the reason I was watching it was because Star Trek was moved from its Friday night time schedule. As an Orthodox Jewish boy, I could never see Star Trek. Even in the summers, when I could watch Friday evening programs that started in my time zone, which was the Central Standard Time Zone in Memphis, I could see programs that were the 7 to 8 programs, or the 8 to 9, or the 6 to 7 programs, the 7 to 8, because Shabbos was around 8 o'clock or 8:20. So I remember my brother and I would watch shows like Friday night's amazing, which is now called Steampunk, but the Wild Wild West, which was an incredibly exciting, interesting series that we would watch. And we were so happy that we could watch some of the summer reruns of the program. But Star Trek, even the summer reruns were impossible to watch because they were shown at 10 from the 9 to 10 time, which a person who kept Shabbos wouldn't be able to watch. But at the last season, as the show was heading towards oblivion, they thought, and cancellation, NBC decided to move the program to Tuesday evening. The original, this episode was supposed to air as part of the last episode ever. And it was because Dwight Eisenhower had died earlier that day, they preempted the program for a tribute to Dwight Eisenhower. Eventually, they showed this episode for the very first time, and it took me, I want to tell you, I still can't get over that episode. And we are talking here, Yitzchak, over 50 years, 50-something years since I saw it. And the reason why it was so impressive to me, because what happened was Kirk, visiting this planet that has radiation in it, and they're trying to find the survivors, discovers a woman there, Dr. Janice Lester, who is someone that it becomes clear later they had some sort of dalliance. They went to school together, officer training school together. She is sort of like, has a minor type of command where she has run what was happening over there. And somehow she is able to, realizing that the distress signal has come out, she lures Kirk in a way that, although she feigns that she is not able to do anything, she really is able to lure him to some sort of apparatus that is able to create some sort of switching of her mind into his body. And she is able to make this switch happen. And most of the episode, William Shatner as Kirk is actually, in a way, really the woman, Janice Lester, inhabiting his body. And I remember the program, the glory that Janice Lester, now that she stole his body and she knocks herself out, Kirk is now trapped in her body. And now she goes to take over the Enterprise, which is something that she feels was denied her. She's been a woman and she's been overlooked. And she feels that of course there was a Star Trek program years later that they, I think was Captain Janeway, some sort of woman that was running the Enterprise, I forgot what it was called, one of the offshoots. But in this original Star Trek, there was this idea that a woman can never make it as the head of to be a ship commander, to actually be a Starfleet commander. And now she has her chance because she's stolen Kirk's body. And I remember that Spock notices there's something a little bit off. He's a little bit different. And since he was exposed to radiation, I remember he had to go for a physical. And here he takes off his shirt, Shatner, showing whatever, type of muscular body he had. And really, here's this woman relishing the fact that she is now and taken over this man's body, and that she's going to live and she's going to be that man, and she's going to finally be him, and he is going to be trapped in her body. It was so shocking. Again, I was only 9 years old, but I remember how unnerving this was, how of an assault this was on my sense of identity. And the program is really deals with the fact that Kirk, who is actually her, Janice, is not able to deal with this switch, and in many ways is part of there's an element of what we would call today like homosexual type of behavior, like the stereotypical homosexual behavior that or types of flourishes that, despite the fact that he's glorying in this man's body, but he sort of has elements of that Shatner sort of like allowed to happen, that you could see that it was that this isn't a man in a man, that there's elements indicating that this is a woman who is somehow playing with the fact that she could be a man. But the greatest part of the episode to me is the fact that what is the essence of a human being, because the erratic actions of the Kirk, and then when Lester, who's really Kirk, awakes, she's able to convince Spock based on stories of what they've been through together. And then, of course, there's a Vulcan mind meld where he realizes that despite the fact that this is Janice Lester, but the mind, the soul, is the soul of Kirk. And there becomes a court-martial. The last scene, it's always, it's funny, it's a space opera, but the last scene is some sort of big trial, like a Perry Mason show. And in the last scene, she takes the stand, making this incredible declaration that she is indeed Kirk and he is not. So Kirk says to Lester, "You claim that you're Captain James T. Kirk?" "No, I'm not Captain Kirk. That's very apparent. I claim that whatever it is that makes James Kirk a living being special to himself is being held here in this body." "Oh, well, so as I understand it, I am Dr. Janice Lester." "That's very clever, but I didn't say it. I said the body of James Kirk is being used by Dr. Janice Lester." A subtlety that somehow escapes me. "I assume that the switch was arrived at mutual agreement." "No, it was brought about by a violent attack by Dr. Lester and the use of equipment she discovered on this planet, called Camus 2. Violence by the lady perpetrated on Captain Kirk? I asked the assembled personnel to look at Dr. Janice Lester and visualize that moment. Can you tell me why Janice Lester would agree to this ludicrous exchange?" "Yes, to get the power she craved, to attain a position she didn't merit by temperament or training. And most of all, she wanted to murder James Kirk, a man who once loved her. But her intense hatred of her own womanhood made life with her impossible." So this is an exact quote from the series. I can't say I remember it word for word, but the tone of it was in my mind, which is, what makes you you? Yes, of course, if that body is got all the organisms and cells of Kirk, the body is Kirk. And yet there's something else that's bigger than that person. And maybe you could lose that. And maybe it can be stolen from you. And if it's stolen from you, that is the most important essence that you have, is that thing that makes you you, the soul. Now, this episode was written by Roddenberry originally, but it was redone by a Jewish fellow by Fred Friedberger. The director was a Jewish person, Herb Wallerstein. Of course, Shatner himself Jewish, Spock Jewish. But it really, in a way, touches, I think, it's like on the primal sense of what a human being is. Now, it also deals with the idea of feminism. It deals with women wanting to be women and agreeing to be women. Now, in the Star Trek world, was the Star Trek world in the 1960s completely equal? It's interesting, Yitzchak, when I did some research on this episode, I discovered that in the original treatment, the very last scene was to have Kirk back in his body. Somehow it happens through some sort of hocus pocus at the end that Kirk gets his body back. But if they're sure, is there a little bit of Lester in her, still in him? So supposedly when a very attractive woman comes on the deck, Kirk shows his usual male interest, and that's how they know he's back. Now, they cut that out, but that shows you, I mean, thank God they did. They cut that out of the episode, but that was their mindset. It was not what we would call the liberated mindset of today, but it was definitely pushing for that. If you remember what I said, she was uncomfortable with her womanhood. And there was an idea, even then, there was a way to discover some sort of essence without coveting what the other person has. There was a way to find greatness without destroying and wanting to steal from somebody else. All of that stuff really resonated in me. And it's the type of thing, as you know, you don't need much special effects. You need good acting to be able to do that. Now, I have to say, before you respond, this episode is one of the most hated episodes by Trekkies. When they have votes about the worst episodes, this always gets in there. But all I can tell you is I've seen the whole run of the original series. I don't think I've seen this one more than once or twice. But the first time I saw it, it left such a deep imprint in me. It still unnerves me about the idea of holding on to your own essence. Go ahead, Yitzchak.
I've never seen this episode. I've only seen a handful of episodes, and that's not one that I've seen. Usually, if I watch Star Trek, it's after Svengoolie, 10 o'clock at night, Motzei Shabbos. It's when it plays on MeTV over here. But certainly those themes are ones that resonate throughout other films. Although I think that was probably the first one that I could think of where that science fiction idea took on the gender bending role. That, I'm not familiar with any other science fiction film or TV episode, no episodes of The Twilight Zone, The Outer Limits, that took that particular aspect, meaning whenever someone's body was stolen, it was always male to male or female to female. There was not this idea from one to the other, and I can understand how that would be unnerving. Now that there's so much discussion about these types of ideas in the world, it probably would not be as unnerving today. But certainly, I can understand that was certainly breaking a barrier, whether positive or negative. It was crossing a line, and
Star Trek did that, as you know. Today it all seems mild, but of course it had the first interracial kiss, where Kirk is being managed by some uber mind that causes to play with the members of the Enterprise, and he ends up kissing Uhura, Denise Nichols, who plays the lieutenant, the communications officer. That was the first interracial kiss on television. So, Star Trek is today, those steps seem very mild, but Star Trek was a groundbreaker as far as that goes. But you're right. This is the idea of switching bodies and brains going in. That has a pretty old Hollywood tradition. I know you've got a goodie on that one as well, right?
Well, I have two movies in mind, but I think I'll start with the more famous of the two. I don't want to get into the film too much. It's a very well-known film, and a classic, probably one of the best of the 50s science fiction movies, and not the only one not even the first one to look into this subject, but it's The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which became really a classic. They termed the pod people there's a comic strip that I read called Barney.
Much on special effects, the idea that you can be replaced and taken over, right? Right. I think basically the way it works is, although the movie doesn't go into too much, elaboration of, exposition of what exactly is going on, but it seems like whatever these beings are, they plant themselves near you, and somehow planting themselves in the ground or something, they're able to replicate who you are and create a complete copy of you. Now, unlike the Star Trek episode that I referred to, where I assume the memories were not intact, these pod people can actually, once they kill you, as it were, and they've siphoned off enough of who you are, and then they grow themselves into a version of you, then basically they have all your memories completely, correct?
Yeah, but they don't have the emotions. They don't have, and that's the difference. Whereas in the Star Trek episode, you have the emotions. You have a lot more of the essence, that to the point where almost that the soul is captured. Here, it's almost like you have the body without the soul. That's one, and it's a very strong spiritual aspect of this movie. And yet, if we could. Today was the Semicha-Darshening, and I reflect often on the Semicha-Darshening about how the Targum Shivim, the Septuagint, was translated on the 8th of Tevis, and it's one of the reasons why we fast. And it seems so incongruous. Why should we fast? Because the Torah is translated to another language, and in a miraculous way, it should be a thing to celebrate. But the problem was, among many other things, was that the Septuagint was a body without a soul. It was a pod people copy of the Torah, where you only had the body was replicated, but the neshama was not replicated the way that the Targum Onkelos, on the other hand, that we celebrate, captures the neshama of the Torah. The Septuagint is the pod people of the Torah in a certain sense. Yes, I just thought about that now. So
yes, that is this is a chiddush that no one has ever said before.
Yeah, but the thing that really strikes me about that movie, and like you said, that it's the acting as opposed to the special effects that really captures this film. It's very well acted, very well directed. But the fascinating thing is the errors of the film enhance the film in a way, meaning it is a film that has a total lack of continuity. That's something that's so important in television and in film, to ensure that there's continuity, and often a sign of ineptness in a film is a lack of continuity. When you have day for night shots, and they switch back and forth, and all kinds of inept ways to make films. And here it was intentional. It would seem that there is not this continuity, meaning, like you just said, we don't really know how it happens. And there's, throughout the movie, you have this sense of that the bodies are being replicated by the pods, and it's not your body that's being transformed.
And I think Kevin McCarthy has a difficult time, because once he senses what's going on, he can't get people to believe it, because the person is an exact replica, right? And a sense of humor, right? A sense of humor, that's somehow the difference. Many of us walk days and days without discovering our sense of humor or our feelings, right? But and we can all smile and pretend like we're feeling something, so nobody believes him. I think that's part of the paranoia of the film, is that even when he discovers that this has happened and that they have taken over, and more of them, and again, part of it is also, I guess, the incredible conceit that when you sleep, that's when they're going to get you, right? Of course, everybody needs to sleep, and it's when you sleep, and when we think we're waking up, as you say, and I'll be rabbinic too, as a new neshama. Oh boy, you aren't a new neshama. This is the ultimate shade, right? Washing Negelwasser is not going to help you on this, baby, because you've gone into sleep. The Koyach HaTumah has taken you over completely. You're not at all the same person. Yeah. A Bria Chadosha, yes. Yeah. You are as the Rashi. We say part of the reason you're supposed to wash the Tilas Yadayim is because when you wake up, you're like a Bria Chadosha in the invasion of the body snatchers. You are a complete different Bria Chadosha Lagamri.
That was what I was getting to, is that throughout the movie, we're presented that the pod people are transforming and replacing and then at the end of the movie, his fiance falls asleep for a second while they're kissing, and during that moment, she is transformed, and you don't see that it's growing out of a pod. And I think that lack of continuity lends itself to make us question as to whether or not this is reality, or it is his fantasy, it is his hysteria, it is his hallucination. And it's only really at the end of the movie, it was supposed to remain ambiguous until they changed the end of the movie to make it that, they actually did find that these pods are being, sent to other cities, and it's confirmed that he's not imagining this. But all throughout the movie, you have this sense of, is he experiencing, is this mental illness? Someone who works among mentally ill people who live, with these types of fantasies in their minds as their reality. I know a lot of people that I minister to, whether in the prison or in the hospital, who really believe that the COs around them are actually hybrid extraterrestrials and all kinds of things that they're sure of these things. It's not even a question to them. And
well, again, Kevin McCarthy breaks the fourth wall. Everybody knows this. I'm not spoiling anything. At the very end of the film, where he looks out to the audience and says, "You're next," right? They're coming. You're next, because that is really the ultimate fear factor. Is that you just watch the show, but think about it yourself. Now, look, Don Siegel. Don Siegel is the director, and of course, a Jewish fellow. We've talked about him before a couple of weeks ago in the Big Steal. I think this was really, he directs this very crisply, as far as I remember. And last week we spoke about The Most Dangerous Game. And I mentioned to you, Yitzchak, that I felt that how many times the idea had been replicated. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers has been done at least 3 or 4 times, and various films that have ripped it off. So, again, there was the remake, the 78 remake with Donald Sutherland and Brooke Adams, which, again, the special effects of watching Brooke Adams fall apart and crumble, that can stay with you for many years as well. And it also ends, I don't know if you've seen the 78 version, technically, well, you should, because you should compare it. There's the, Donald Sutherland, who has been the Kevin McCarthy character, who's been arguing, and telling people that the pods are here. At the end of that film, he goes to work. And of course, the other people that he's been trying to convince are now finally on his side. And when he opens his mouth to speak, he just lets out some sort of primal, terrible, monstrous yell, which I guess is the language of the way the pod people really speak, indicating that he has become a pod person, which is not like the original. But that scream that issues out of Donald Sutherland's mouth is quite terrible. Still, despite the technical and power of the remake, I think that the original still is the champion as far as that goes. And again, there have been many. But Yitzchak, I know that there's, besides that film, again, we could talk an hour on the Invasion of the Body Snatchers and what its significance was. But there's other films about people's brains being put into someone else's brain and their minds changing. I think there's really more of a similarity, especially as Kirk can't hold on. Like if we're going with the, Turnabout, Intruder, there's a lot of films in Hollywood which pretty much had the very same arc, where the person, that brain that's in that person isn't so stable, and that person sort of takes on, it would seem it's a transplant, but in some ways that the mind of that's been put in there is somehow going to assert itself, despite the body and everything else that's there, right? And I think that's another film that you made me aware of, which actually has 2 of your favorites in it, Karloff and Lugosi both, right? And that's
right. It's Black Friday. It's the name of the film,
right? Why is it? So Black Friday sort of has very similar idea, right, to both of these stories we're talking about, right? Why don't you tell a little bit about what occurs there in Black Friday, right?
The story is that Karloff plays a doctor who saves his friend who was shot by a gangster. His friend was a very kindly English professor, and they lived in a small college town. and he saves his life by taking a brain transplant or partial brain transplant from the gangster that shot his friend, and using that as a type of therapy to save his friend's life. And then he realizes that part of the mind of this gangster wound up, in the body of his friend, to the point where when the gangster was trying to, had left over some treasure somewhere in New York City, far away from this small college town where they were living, that he brings the friend back to New York City to try to find the loot that the gangster had left behind. And one of the ways that they advertised this film, which was so shocking and quite disturbing, was that they said that Karloff was one of the main characters, and Bela Lugosi had a more minor role as one of these gangsters, that the gangster whose brain was still in the body of this college professor, that he wanted to take revenge on all the people that were responsible for doing him in. And so one of them was played by Lugosi, who he gets killed in the movie, and they advertised this, that he was hypnotized to believe that he was actually getting killed while making this film in order to give a more convincing
I see. But basically, I think what you're saying is that they got Lugosi to agree, but really Lugosi has a pretty minor part. I think the main acting, just like in the Star Trek episode, which many people think Shatner should have gotten an Emmy for, but because it was preempted by Eisenhower's death, it was too late to be submitted for the Emmys. The main acting is the acting of the professor, who changes from this kindly professor, and he has to go in the film to sort of become more like the gangster whose part of the brain is now inside his body, right?
Right, and he does this without any makeup, just taking off his glasses and throwing back his hair, and it's quite impressive how he.
Right, and that's, let's say who he is. That's Stanley Ridges, who was born in England, who actually shows up in a number of films in minor roles, but I actually remember him doing a wonderful portrayal of Professor Seletsky in To Be or Not to Be. I'm a very big chassid of Lubitsch, and this is, of course, Lubitsch's. Some people think it's one of his best comedies, and he in that role he plays a pretty. He also goes through a change, because he's really a Nazi. He sounds like he's really the best friend of all the Polish airmen, but really he is a Nazi turncoat who's trying to gather information in order to get all these people killed by the Nazis. So Ridges, I think, has a history of being able to play a character in a real way, where not just one dimensional. So it's really, would you say, probably in Black Friday? And why is it called Black Friday anyway? I can understand why the two other films, the two other shows we talked about, their titles are self-evident. What's the reason why it's called Black Friday?
I think because that was the day that the Karloff character was executed, was on a Friday. The movie opens with his execution, and he hands over his notes about the experiment and everything that happened over to a news reporter, if I remember correctly. And the whole story is told in flashback. The news reporter reading the story, waiting for Karloff to be executed for a murder, and that's really where it came down to. I believe that it was a Friday that the execution took place. I could be wrong, but I think that's the connection.
Well, the story was written by Kurt Siodmak. I think that's the way you pronounce his name, and he was pretty famous.
He escaped from the Nazis. He was also Jewish,
right? And
he the Wolfman and many other.
And he wrote the script for The Invisible Man Returns and other things. So Kurt
Frankenstein also had the same type of a theme of moving the brain from one to another, and both Karloff and Lugosi. Well, no, Karloff wasn't in that, but Karloff and Lugosi were in Son of Frankenstein, but The Ghost of Frankenstein, which was the sequel to Son of Frankenstein, Lugosi really had his best role in those two films as Igor.
Right. Yes, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
But Siodmak, but again, this was a theme. Obviously, this is not just, look, you have to put enough potboiler elements into the story to get everybody into the seats. Like, there has to be enough there. There has to be gangsters. There has to be, but obviously what Siodmak and company are working on here is something a little bit more than just, it's really like an exploration of the Jekyll and Hyde story about what is human being, how a human being could change. The director is Arthur Lubin. Something tells me, I don't know much about Arthur Lubin, but he did direct Buck Privates, which is one of your favorites, I know, from Abbott and Costello. So it's possible. Again, I'm not sure about whether he was a Jewish person or not, but he also did Arthur Lubin also was the main producer and director of the Francis the Talking Mule series. You might remember that with Donald O'Connor. So
yeah, sure.
So I think there was a lot of Jewish energy in this film, in the sense of what is a human being. So I think all three of these programs, that we're suggesting, are really different ways of contemplating what is it that makes us, and who are we. And I think in that way, seeing it, other program and that another film that really, I saw it, I suppose in my 20s was the first time I saw it. And it also took, I probably heard about it. It wasn't shown regularly, but it shows up today. If you do an internet search of, the greatest films of all time, or it shows up, the greatest American films of all times, it shows up consistently there. And that is Charles Laughton, who was very well known as an actor. He was involved with Elsa Lanchester. I think they were actually married. And yeah. She of course was the bride of Frankenstein. But Charles Laughton was a very exalted actor in the 30s. He was much more than a character actor. He won an Academy Award. He played the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was quite an accomplished person, brilliant man, obviously very smart fellow. And this was his only directorial outing. And of course, it's 1955's The Night of the Hunter, which is the story about a preacher, and it's based on actually real events that occurred in West Virginia during the Depression. They called the preacher Mr. Powell. His real name, the one it was based on, was a fellow by the name of Powers, who was a person who had, I guess, had some sort of training in seminaries and had become a serial killer of women. And based on his life, a novel was written in the early 1950s, which was turned into this film from 1955. Robert Mitchum, as I said, stars sort of counter to who he had been up until this point. Robert Mitchum was the king of cool, was this film noir hero, detective, finding out stuff, everyman, heartthrob. He was considered like, the Brad Pitt of his day. Everybody was swooning over him. All the girls would swoon over Mitchum. And he had been, and that had been the case for a good 10, 12 years before he made this film. But in this film, he sort of plays not a hero at all. He plays a terrible villain. In fact, one of the most vicious, ugly, cowardly villains, but also a villain who talks to God. Most people know about this, and I'm sure you've seen images of, and this comes out of the book, that he had on his knuckles tattooed on one knuckle the letters LOVE. I think that was on his right hand, and on his left hand the words HATE, hate. And the idea of a conflicted person. Mitchum in his preaching in the film constantly refers to the violence of Cain and Abel. And when he talks about love versus hate, he always uses incredibly Cain as, and it's clear that this is a man that, Charles Laughton and the writer James Agee and others see as a biblical Cain, as someone who murders and keeps on murdering. He is someone who speaks to God. He's someone who talks to God and says, God, you put violence in your book. There's a lot of a criticism that Lawton had of the United States and of the religion of its time. Because here you have a person who isn't just a phony. He's a person who actually believes himself to have a connection to God and kills with God's agreement and believes that the books of the Bible sanction what he's doing. Of course, it deals with, it has Shelley Winters, who, again, you can't get Brooklyn out of her. She's supposed to be playing a West Virginia widow who ends up being sort of seduced by this preacher who discovers when he's in jail that her husband, who's going to be executed, played by Peter Graves, by the way, James Arness's younger brother, and of course the star of Mission Impossible for so many years. So Peter Graves has stolen money from a bank or something, or from other people, and has a huge amount of money for its time, and he has hidden it somewhere before he was apprehended by the police. The beginning of the film, he's hidden it with his two children, who are really, in a way, with Robert Mitchum, the stars of the movie. The two children, one of the actors, he is the boy who is 9 years old, sort of the same age I was when I saw the Star Trek show, and he is the one who recognizes that he's been entrusted with the money by his father. His father goes to is executed, and is executed, and everyone knows about that. And then his cellmate in prison, as I said, was Mitchum, playing Harry Powell, who comes to their town in order to find the money, seduce the mother, and somehow discover from the children where the money is, because he can't get Peter Graves to speak about it before he dies, but he's going to find out, and he's going to use the power of the Lord to do that. And of course, the power of the Lord is his own killing ways. As I said, Shelley Winters, again, she is basically just putty in his hands. She's someone who is, recognizes eventually that he's only after her for the money, but she actually becomes transformed spiritually. She realizes that even though, Harry might be evil, the words that he says do have some spiritual significance. And she decides to dedicate herself to become a spiritual woman, to actually work for God, despite that. And part of what the film deals with is her as a sexual being, and in general, the relationship that Americans had to their sexual life, and how, there's plenty of comments there, how ugly it is, how disgusting it is, how pure one has to be really be religious. And this is what she gives her life up to. She almost knows that she's going to be slaughtered. And although you don't see her death, you see her later as she is one of the most beautiful scenes I've ever seen in Hollywood, which is you see her under the water, strapped into a Model T with her throat cut, but with her long hair flowing in the water in a state of what looks like serene, suspended animation, but obviously dead. She gets knocked off pretty easy. The rest of the film is really him chasing the children, because the children have the money. And the most haunting imagery that almost have ever been put onto Hollywood. Lawton hired Stanley Cortez, who was the cinematographer for the Magnificent Ambersons and many other films. And what he was looking for was a D.W. Griffith look. He was looking for the silent imagery, the images from silent films, where the movies were told so much by a shadow, much more than what the words that were being said. And this film has a fable-like feel to it. It has a feel like a fable. Its beauty is really unsettling, because the children make their way down the river, escaping from this monster who uses religion who has a switchblade, who kills women, and he's after them. And the idea of good versus evil, and the fact that the adult world is flawed, the fact that the adult world is wrong-centered, the fact that the adult world allows hypocrisy to reign, that allows religious fanaticism to be spread, and that children need to be protected, and that children are really the hope. And yet, is there any hope really for them? Can we change the world around us to allow the children to live and be strong and to be unaffected? The film really doesn't really offer that as a real possibility, because the children escape, and they end up being protected by a woman whose children have left her, but now sees herself as this mother for a number of Depression era waifs who have no place to go, and she is their protector. She talks to herself. She's eccentric. She's played by what in times 30 years before that was one of the leading ladies in Hollywood, was Lillian Gish, who plays the role of Ms. Rachel, who is the protector of the children. And there is she represents good, and she reads from the Bible as well. But what she reads from the Bible is about Moses and the bulrushes. She reads about baby Jesus, who is being sought by Herod. To her, the Bible is not about the story of Cain and the story of human murder and the story of human murder and human penance, but really the stories in the Bible that she celebrates to her children is the innocence and significance of these children who grow up to be kings, these children who become figures larger than life. This is what she believes in, despite the Depression, terrible era that she lives in. And the standoff between good and evil, which Stephen King, of course, did in The Stand and other places, very much ripping off The Night of the Hunter in terms of Randall Flagg and I forgot the mother in The Stand that represents the spirituality. It really is taken almost directly from this film. There's again, its fingerprints are in many places in terms of this Southern Gothic spirit and idea of what is good and what is evil. It's interesting. I think you would find that the mother, Lillian Gish, has 5 children with her, and one of them looks like she's supposed to be around 12 or 14 or 15. Yeah, the oldest, that girl who's sort of like a child but becoming a woman, who's interested in men, who goes, and actually the film is very open. I mean, the fact that it passed the censors, she says how she's been with men. It's clear that she's been sleeping, she's been going out and discovering strange men, and she is enamored because she meets the hunter. She meets Harry Powell, she meets Mitchum, and just like any Bobby Soxer, she's so entranced by him, and she's trying to seduce him in a way. And of course, he uses her to discover where the children are. And she's played by Gloria Castillo, who
the sexual elements of Night of the Hunter. You mentioned that Charles Lawton was married to Elsa.
He was married to her, but he was obviously gay as they come. You know what I'm saying?
It was a marriage of convenience.
Yes, I mean, I think they probably liked it.
They loved each other very much, but
yes,
as friends. And I'm wondering, how much of that is what's coming out.
I agree with you 100%, Yitzchak. I was going to mention that, but yes, again, Lawton uses sexuality in this film. He's critiquing typical, aggressive sexual behavior. He's really criticizing how America's sensibilities are very rigid and unthinking. Yes, it isn't just about the 1930s West Virginia. It clearly is about the 1950s America that he had to sort of hide in. And I think, it definitely does have that. You definitely get that 100%. he definitely indicates how powerful the drives are, but also how ludicrous our sensibilities about them are. And in a way, I guess if somebody takes a certain message from that, it is that the idea of true spirituality is not to be found in the ugly rantings that can be taken out of a Bible, and also again warning against because the same people that Lawton makes a point, the same people that are enamored of Harry Powell when he first comes to town and consider him a great preacher, when they discover that he is actually a serial killer and a seducer and a murderer, they are ready to lynch him. And the same people are out there, and Lawton spends a lot of time showing the ugliness of the lynch mob. And he seems to relish in it. That really, like all great films, things are not black and white. They aren't straight. And sometimes, we are on your way out. Take care. Be well.
Thanks for joining us for another episode from the Yeshiva of Newark at IDT Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a single episode.